Hello, welcome to another installment of Movies on Movies as part of Asian Cinema 2017, and another video that is a companion piece to an Epic Film Challenge 2 review. I talked about the 1990 film Close Up, directed by Abbas Kiarostami, and this film, Close Up Long Shot, is a documentary made 5 years after the making of Close Up, not directed by Abbas Kiarostami, directed by another filmmaker, focusing on the subject or the star of Close Up, being the man Hossein Sabzian, who, if you're unaware, and again this video is very much a companion piece to my Close Up review, but if you're just watching this one on its own for some reason, the story goes that this Iranian man, Hossein Sabzian, a huge fan of films, of cinema, he was on a bus one day and a woman sat next to him, and he was reading a script book from the filmmaker Mohsen Makhmalbaf, and she noted the book, and he basically said, yeah, I made this film, and he passed himself off as this director. And so she kind of was very taken by this, and invites him over to the house, and for a few days he basically impersonated this famous film director in Iran. Then he got found out, and that's what the film Close Up is about. And so and he plays himself in the Close Up is this documentary, but they use all the real people to reenact the events. It's a very strange film, a very wonderful film. And Close Up Long Shot is a straight documentary that follows up with Hossein after the events of the film being made, as well as the incident where he impersonated Makhmalbaf. So this is a really interesting companion film to Close Up, and I think it's almost essential viewing for anyone who watches Close Up. Thankfully, Filmstruck included this on the page for Close Up, and I believe it must be on the Blu-ray for the Criterion Collection as well. Anyway, this film is not a great documentary. It's a very good one, but it's fairly standard, fairly kind of by the numbers. A lot of the interviews will kind of fade to white and then fade back in again just to kind of mask the cuts in the interview, which felt a bit dated to me. But I mean, it's good in the way that it approaches some of the subjects. The subject, which is of course the man himself, Hossein Sabzian, and his experience with making this film, being in this film Close Up, and how the public view him, and so how the filmmaker who made this documentary approaches his subject at first is from the outside. We see the perspective of people in the neighborhood where Hossein lives. We hear from people who had basically been around him for most of his life and had seen him, around and about on the streets, and yeah, I know him, I've said hello in passing and things like that, and yeah, he's a bit of an odd character, and we saw that film Close Up, so you get the kind of the neighbour's point of view. They're not his friends, they're his acquaintances, and so it doesn't appear that he has really many friends. Even a guy who occasionally hires him for work is like, yeah, I hire him sometimes because I feel bad, but I know that his heart's not fully in it. It's a really sad and devastating film in a lot of ways, because it really shows you not how the film kind of ruined this man's life, but how films ruined this man's life. And he's very open about this, Hossein. He gives these kind of monologues basically in the film when he's interviewed, and he talks about how films have destroyed my life. I love them, and yet they have taken everything away from me. They've taken my family away from me. And it all stems back to his childhood. He talks about when he was a kid, he took 3 months off school. Without telling his parents, he would write these essays and then grade them A, to pass off that he was still going to school, but every day he was going to the movies. His dad took him to see a movie once, he became completely enraptured with it, and that was kind of his life from then on. He just had to go to the movies. But then his dad found out, and he got beaten. A very horrible story where his dad took him over to his friend's house, and they all took Hossein down to the basement and kind of pushed him over and just all took turns whipping him and laughing at him. And a very horrible story, but at the same time, when you look at Close Up and you look at this man who impersonated someone for 4 days, clearly, got lost in this fantasy. And the people who talk about Hossein in this film, they say that, this is a guy who, he's a bit of an odd character. He's a dreamer. And there's even one person who says that, he's a weird guy, and he's a dreamer, and I don't think I'd ever really trust anything that comes out of his mouth because, his head's always in the clouds. I'm paraphrasing, basically. And the director says, would you say that to his face? And he's like, yeah. So they're like, okay, Hossein, they bring him over, and then they film Hossein in close-up while this guy repeats what he just said about how you're a dreamer, and you know, the truth is certainly not something that is a key factor in his life, and he kind of digests that, and basically at the end says, you know, he's not wrong. I agree with what he says, you know, and I'll continue to live in this dream because I'm trying to chase something. And again, I'm paraphrasing this very loosely, but that's kind of the general idea of this man's life, is that films became a refuge to him, but also they became this destructive force for him. They became an obsession that kind of took him away from everything else that was important. You know, one of his co-workers, the guy who says that he feels sorry for him when he hires him every now and again, says that, yeah, he's always talking about films, all the time. He wastes his own time with it, he wastes the people he works with time with it. You know, it's just a bit full on, basically. And when you hear him talk for extended passages in this film, you know, he's constantly quoting directors, constantly quoting people here and there. He's like Orson Welles said this, like so-and-so said this. You know, he's absorbed himself in movies. And I think that that's quite a dangerous thing. But you could take that to anything, really, to absorb yourself, to obsess yourself with something to the degree that the rest of your life deteriorates around you. So this film is a very a cautionary tale, and a very depressing one, I feel like, you know. There's some things in it that I found really interesting, like just the little quotes that he came up with, you know, like, every time I see a good film, I feel reborn. And I can kind of jive with that, you know. But it's this idea of it just being this all-consuming thing. And he talks about the film Close-Up that he was in, and how he feels used by the director, Abbas Kiarostami. How when he finally met Mohsen Makhmalbaf, he liked him but felt like he should keep his distance from him. He, you know, he's very poetic in the way he talks about these things. I mean, he waxes lyrical about his life and the way he sees it, and the things that he thinks about his life as they're related to films, and the film that he did in Close-Up, and how he ultimately got to be in a film. And kind of the irony of how when he impersonated Makhmalbaf, he said to this family, you know, we'll make a film in your house. And they were rehearsing to make this film that was never going to happen. And yet, what he said, we're going to make a film and you're going to be in it, actually happened. In different circumstances, but it still happened, you know. And there definitely is an ironic twist with that. It's like meta within meta, and then in the middle of that, there's more meta. Like, it just, this film and Close-Up, it's just, there's so much meta going on throughout the whole circumstance and situation. And I read that Hossein, he died, I think, at age 52, which is fairly young. But he certainly seemed like someone who was just living in squalor. You know, one of the people interviewed in this documentary says that, you know, all he owns is the clothes on his back. You know, it's not like being in this film, you know, made him money or, you know, changed his living circumstances. We see, you know, the job that he has, but also some of the bitterness that he has. But also, you know, he also says that as far as the film goes, Close-Up, you know, it's been both positive and negative. It's two sides of a coin. You know, there's people who look at Close-Up and they see him in a negative light, and that's hard for him. Was hard for him. But when they see it in a positive light, he likes that. You know, so it's not like he condemns the film, but he does feel like he was used at the same time. But he also feels like, because people called him a con man for impersonating this director, you know, he feels like it was taken far too seriously. It was taken to be something much bigger than it was. And he feels like his intent was never malicious, and yet people tried to paint it out to be. And he feels like, well, if I'm being a con man by kind of, you know, making myself feel good for a few days without really harming anyone, you know, the people who, you know, Abbas Kiarostami was a con man for making the film about my life, you know, about this part of my life. The reporter who wrote the initial article about the incident, you know, he was using me. So he was a con man, you know. The family that took me in and thought I was this famous director, they were using me, thinking I was this famous director for their own prestige. They were con men, you know. So he goes into that idea too. And the end of the film basically ends with him running out of stuff to say, and he's like, okay, I'm just, I feel like I'm on a soapbox here, let's just cut. And that's the end, you know. But he says some interesting stuff, and it feels like this is a guy who maybe could have written some interesting films. You know, he had this kind of poetic edge to the way that he told these stories, but also looking at Close-Up, looking at his history, and the people in this documentary who say that he's, you know, he has these stories that he comes up with. You can never really take what he says at face value. It makes you wonder how much of an unreliable narrator he really is. Even in the stories that he tells about his youth. I mean, he says that when he went to see this film, his mother gave him money to buy some gasoline, and he hid the gasoline tank and just went to the movies instead. And he sat there in the first showing, And then he sat there for the second showing, realised he was going to get beaten up by his dad when he got home. So he stayed for the third showing. And for the third showing, he couldn't even concentrate on the film because he was so afraid of his dad beating him up. And he stayed till the final showing. And then he went to the toilets, and then he came back in, slept in the theatre, woke up, you know, and said he never went home for 3 months and stayed with his friend. And then his father finally found him, took him home, beat him up again. But I find it quite unrealistic that someone could go to their friend's house and be there for 3 months until their parents found them. I don't know, it's possible, but that feels a little bit shaky to me. So it's intriguing for sure, but I definitely feel like he is someone who had a very hard childhood, and movies were an escape. They became too much of an escape, and this film is kind of a portrait of a man who obsessed over something for so long, and through this very strange you know, period in his life, a very short period in his life, he basically became a part of cinema history, but in a very unique and different way, and in a way that, you know, didn't exactly fulfill the dreams that he probably had of being a filmmaker or being an actor. As he says in Close Up, maybe he would prefer to have been an actor. So he got his moment of glory in a way in being in Close Up. I mean, he is the focus of that film. He plays himself, and he is himself in that film. But of course that film plays with the idea of identity and so on, but I won't get into that because I probably would have already talked about that in the close-up review. But as for this film, it's a really interesting, again, companion piece to Close Up. I think anyone who enjoyed Close Up should definitely check this out if they can find it. If they have the Criterion Blu-ray, it's a no-brainer. Definitely check it out. 43 minutes long. As a film itself, you know, it's fairly standard, you know, and I can't really give it too much credit because when you're just filming someone saying all these interesting things and you have a really interesting subject, you know, it does the work for you in a way. I mean, it's done okay, you know, but it felt a little bit, you know, standard in terms of the way that it was put together. Most of it is literally just a talking head of Hossein kind of talking about his life and how movies factor into it, and it's kind of, again, very sad to see someone destroyed by their own obsession and readily admitting that, you know, movies have ruined my life, they've robbed me of everything, you know, but yet it's still his passion, that's still what he lives for. So very, very interesting guy, very interesting character, and a very interesting documentary. And yeah, and I figured it was so appropriate for Movies on Movies because this is a documentary about a guy who loved movies and was in a movie about him pretending to be a guy who made movies. I mean, it's just, it's a movie inception loop. So yeah, anyway, that's it for now. Thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.
He's alright by me. Apart from the fact he throws cans of Carlin into a tree. Yeah, he's really cool. Yeah, he's really cool. But he's not quite as cool as you, 'cause